Hi everyone and welcome. We're out here in my yard checking in on my outdoor worm bin. Now this outdoor worm bin is kind of undergoing a test because it is January and I'm in the northern hemisphere, so it is winter time for us right now. And it's been about 4 weeks. In fact, it's been exactly 4 weeks. It's been 28 days since the last time I added food, and the only food that I added at that time was some coffee grounds and I believe it was the day prior to that, 29 days ago, that we last checked in on it in terms of producing a video and checking in on it together. So there's been really no activity with this bin, other than me taking it in for a couple days because there was a really cold spell that blew through shortly after I filmed the last video. And we had days when the high temperatures only got into the 20s and we had low temperatures overnight in the teens. So I was worried that it might freeze, so I placed it indoors just for those few days to keep it protected from freezing. But today I figured if by chance there should be the need for more food, I've got a couple pieces of watermelon rind over there on the ground standing by just in case we need to add some more food today. I might just throw in a couple pieces anyway, just for good measure, before I cover it all back up and just leave it out here in the sun to let it capture some of the solar energy and try to help it warm up a little bit before I place it back alongside the house for safekeeping. So let's poke around inside to see what we see inside. Hopefully the worms are doing good. So now, as I was pulling some of these leaves out earlier and placing them into that laundry basket you saw a moment ago, I did start noticing that some worms were hanging out on the leaves. So that's when I started kind of deciding it was best just to leave everything else in here. Now, the material we're seeing here was stuff that had been extracted from the garden as I disassembled my garden. This is actually the stem of the pumpkin that had been thrown in here. So we'll see if we can see any remnants of that pumpkin. These are just the old tomato vines that had been taken down when I was disassembling my garden. And that stuff was really starting to decompose pretty nicely. And the worms do seem to enjoy it. It's kind of nice and damp. Lots of material for them to squirm around through. So I'm just trying to dig my way down to find a point where we can maybe start to see the pumpkin that was added previously. So far I don't see any sign of it. I did attempt to push it down as low as I could into the material so that it would be easy enough for them to get at it. But then again, it's been 4 weeks, so it wouldn't be too surprising to find that they've actually eaten the whole thing. I'm seeing a lot of nice material full of worms. You got to remember that this population is sort of a mix. There's a mix of European nightcrawlers in this bin as well as red wigglers. So we'll set this little pile aside over here. As I go down, I continue to encounter large globs of worms hanging out, feasting on the material. They don't seem to be the least bit concerned about the fact that it's winter time. They seem pretty active and happy and healthy. Now we're starting to get down into where we could see some of these black soldier fly larvae, and I have to assume that they're dead. I think that they're more like a warm weather sort of an insect larvae. But I got to tell you, when they populate a bin, they really work their way through the material quickly. They definitely break down the food stuff very fast. And now as we get to the bottom, now we're just getting into sort of a castings only sort of a material. I don't really have the right gloves for this. This is leather leather gloves. So I'm not going to poke around too much in here. I think I've already more or less confirmed what I was interested in finding out was whether or not the pumpkin that I had placed in here was consumed yet or not, and it does seem that it has been consumed. So I think it's fair to say that a little extra food would be a good idea. So while we've got this lower section of it exposed, I'm going to go ahead and throw in a couple hunks of watermelon for them. Give them those 3 pieces, because all of this other vegetation is all food as well from their point of view, so they should be completely content with everything else that you see in here that's been laid in here as food and bedding for them. What else do we have here? This is something I was kind of experimenting with too, which is some twine. I had a wad of twine, and I still have a whole bunch left too. It's the twine that I was running my my plants, my tomato vines up, and it seems to be a material that they're favoring. So they're all in there, presumably eating this stuff, so that's a good sign. So I like what I'm seeing here. I don't think there's any reason for any sort of concern or worry. Hopefully I haven't disrupted the activity in this bin too much by jostling things around. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that laundry basket that's full of the remaining leaves that I had scooped out of here earlier, and get this whole thing put back together and let the worms continue their work. But I've also got some worms down in the basement that need some feeding as well, the VermiBags that have the African and the European nightcrawlers in them. So I'll come back, turn the camera back on once I'm down in my wormery and I'm ready to feed them after I finish up packing this bin away. Alright, glad to see that we're doing pretty good out here. Alright, let's move on. So now before I put my rubber glove on and start with the feeding of the VermiBags, I thought I would just quickly explain how things are a little bit different here in case you watch my channel regularly. You'll usually see that I've got most of my shelves filled here, and that's mainly because I've not, at least not until now, kept anything on the floor. But a slight change now is that I've got the VermiBag tote down on the floor. I put a little piece of plywood under it, and that's freeing up this upper space here. This is where the VermiBag tote had been previously. So that opens up a little bit more space, because then I've been going in sort of a counterclockwise direction here to put the oldest stuff here, and then in a clockwise fashion work your way to the newer of my bins. What's happening here though is this is just a placeholder for the oldest of my red wiggler bins. The oldest of my red wiggler bins is currently being used as the foundation for a new time lapse that I'm shooting. This time lapse is featuring a pumpkin again. One of my most popular videos is that of a pumpkin being placed into one of these bins, and then the worms eventually eating the whole thing down until there's nothing left but just the skin on top. It's been about 10 days now since that bin received that pumpkin, and that pumpkin is actually progressing quite nicely as the worms devour it from the bottom up. So that's where the oldest of my red wiggler bins would belong normally. And the rest of these bins are also red wigglers. But today we're really going to be focusing on the two the African nightcrawlers in the VermiBag tote and the European nightcrawlers in the VermiBag mini. So I'm going to get those out here and we'll proceed with the feeding. You already saw part of what we're going to be giving them today earlier. I brought down the remainder of the watermelon rinds that we were going to give them. And the rest of the stuff is some potato peels, banana peels, a couple tomatoes, and an apple. So a variety of different things that they're going to get today. So let's get going. Okay, we're going to begin with the VermiBag mini, which has my European nightcrawlers in it. And this piece of cardboard, if you've been following along, you might notice as something a little new, a little different. I just decided that maybe I would try to add one extra layer of cardboard to see if it can perhaps help a little bit with moisture retention, to help prevent excess evaporation. And The worms look pretty content, hanging around right there on the surface, right beneath where the newspaper was. I'm gonna, I guess I'm just gonna push these little guys aside a little bit. This is interesting, this little bulge over here. I wonder, oh, okay, that's an example of two worms connected to one another because they're breeding. And I always feel bad when I disrupt that activity, but it is pretty interesting to see. Lately I have been noticing as I take off the top that I notice a couple worms, you know, taking part in that activity. And I always feel so bad disrupting them. Look at this poor guy. Looks like the one that's burrowing down is a little bit stronger than this one, and this one's probably trying to burrow down in the opposite direction, so they're frantically pulling against each other in the midst of this this connection that they've made with each other. I wonder if I could just sort of scoop them aside and let them immediately be buried as a result of that and not feel so compelled to retreat into the material. One of the first things that came out here was a piece of corn, and here too it looks like these two worms are sort of attached to one another, and I'm wondering if a similar activity is happening here. I'll try to position it upside down so they don't feel like they need to cease their activity on my on my account. So we're just gonna peel back some of the material that we find on our way down to see how it's progressing. Try to make a little bit of room for this next feeding. This next feeding is not going to be too large. I believe the last feeding in here was a little bit more than what they're going to receive today. I can see bits and pieces of what they received previously. These look like apple peel, and this is clearly a hunk of rice. I think this might be an apple core right here. Any larger distinguishable pieces I'll just sort of pile up over here, keep it all together so we can add it all back together at the end. So that's some of their previous feeding. Definitely has sort of that that fermenting apple smell to it. Like if you're walking through an apple orchard, there's like rotting apples on the ground. I'm sure not everyone has had an opportunity to experience that, but you might get an idea of what the smell in here is like. Other than that, there's really no other odor. It does seem like a fair amount of the food that they received previously is still here. But I think what remains down here is pretty much small little scraps. This would be a piece of the coffee filter. No, well, partially the coffee filter that the food was placed into last time, as well as a banana peel. And there's the stem of the banana peel. So we got a pretty good sized pile of previously added food bits that are still being worked on. And that stuff is probably readily accessible to the worms because it's probably all been infiltrated by bacteria and the decomposition process has started, sort of making the food material a little bit more liquidy and jelly-ish. And the whole idea of putting the next feeding in is just to give that next round of food an opportunity to also get infiltrated by bacteria and fungi, to also help it start the breakdown process so that at some point it too can get consumed by the worms. So before this next batch of food goes in, I'm going to lay down some bedding material, a little bit of shredded paper for them. I'm just going to wet it down a little bit because it is dry. The material in this bin has a nice moisture content overall, and that could be because I was in here a day or two ago spraying down the material And it was at that time that I added that extra layer of cardboard on top to try to keep the evaporation to a minimum. So we'll start off by throwing in a tomato, a couple banana peels, a couple of these watermelon rinds, paper, and a couple cherry tomatoes. That looks pretty good. And I'm running a little bit low on grit these days, on eggshell, ground up eggshell. So it's been a couple feedings since this bin last received eggshell. So maybe by the next go around I'll have had a chance to make more. But for now I'm skipping the eggshell and the grit addition. So I'm just going to throw in a little bit of coffee grounds, like I usually do, because that stuff adds up around here as well, pretty much. And we'll get all these old bits and pieces of food back down into the feeding zone, including these 2 hunks of corn. Alright, banana peel, some other odds and ends. So things are looking pretty good in this bin. It's always very promising when you see signs of reproduction. It's usually an indicator that the worms are content and not feeling overly crowded. So they feel comfortable expanding their population. So we'll get this bin covered up, let these little guys get back to work. That's what I usually refer to as my feeding zone indicator, coffee filter. Piece of newspaper, which was thoroughly drenched yesterday or maybe the day before, last time I was in here with the squirt bottle. And then this new piece of cardboard, pretty tight fitting across the top. Also attempting to just keep the moisture level in the bin as high as possible without too much evaporation happening. Let's move on to the other bag. Okay, so in my VermiBag tote, to keep this ventilation panel covered and to try to reduce moisture from escaping through that, I keep that piece of cardboard on top. I guess on a more hot and humid day, or maybe in the seasons when it's a little bit less dry like it is now in the winter, it might be fine to leave that off to permit ventilation, but I'm just finding that on these dry summer months it's a bit hard to keep these bins comfortable and damp where the worms would feel comfortable. So I'm just looking around to see if I could find any other similar signs of reproduction happening, like we saw earlier in the European nightcrawler bag. These African nightcrawlers are huge. Look at the size of that worm. Well-fed worm. Since I've typically always composted with red wigglers, which are a relatively small-sized worm, it's always kind of interesting to first see the inhabitants of these nightcrawler bins, because the nightcrawlers are a larger breed of worm. And I'm always just taken aback a little bit by their sheer size. Just because over the past couple years that I've been doing this, I've always had red wigglers, and I'm still not yet fully accustomed to seeing such hefty, large-sized worms in my bins. So now these African nightcrawlers have been treated very much the same as the European nightcrawlers in the VermiBag Mini. These African nightcrawlers here in the VermiBag tote also have 2 pieces of corn, as we saw in the VermiBag Mini, that the European nightcrawlers are working on. And the previous feeding, I believe, was very similar as well to what the last bag received. So here, for example, is a apple, and it's just interesting because it seems almost as if the peel of the apple had been just nibbled off, leaving the fleshy part of the apple behind. Because I remember this as just being a full apple. It's interesting. And it's funny because one of the things that are going into this bin are another full apple. So some of the other food items I'm finding in here, as we saw in the previous bin, are more apple stuff. My mom likes to prepare all kinds of delicious pastries that include apple, kind of like apple tarts and different types of apple pastries. So that's why I've got all this apple, compliments of my mom. And the last feeding was placed into these coffee filters, and the intention was to, you know, boost up the level of bedding in here and carbon for them by wrapping their food in coffee filters. I've got to say that the moisture level in here is excellent, maybe even a little more moist than it needs to be, and that's, you know, probably due to this fairly good sized feeding that they received last go around, and probably also has a lot to do with the fact that I've been adding moisture. You know, when I come in here to add the moisture, I don't really poke around and examine the material. I just, you know, uncover it and start spraying. And I think based on what I'm seeing here today, I think I'm probably going to hold off on doing that for a little while, because it seems like we're safe for now. I think it was only because of what I observed in a previous feeding that I felt like it might be necessary to intervene and try to, you know, boost up the moisture levels in here a little bit to keep it comfortable for them. So I think we've got ourselves a pretty good sized pit. We've pretty much more or less made our way down to the very bottom of the bag. So here too, I'm going to use shredded paper as a bedding, and then we'll just place in the food. Okay. I find it useful to have the spray bottle on hand, and I'm not adding water right now because I feel that there's a need for more moisture. I just like to use it as a way to sort of keep the behavior of this shredded paper in check. By wetting it a little bit, it seems to lay down and take shape a lot more readily than if it's just thrown in here dry and it just tries to spring up and bounce around and go any which way. This way I'm just able to sort of steer it into the position that I want it to be in a little bit more easily than if it were dry. So let's see, we're going to throw in this old corn cob, another old corn cob. Here's this old apple. What we'll do is we'll place the new apple right alongside of it. And I'm looking at all this food that I need to add still. Huh. It's going to be a hefty feeding. Because then we've still got this piece of watermelon rind that sort of fits in here, as well as some potato peel. And I've got a couple more tomatoes that started to go bad, and a couple more staple food items such as banana peel. I guess I'll just pour out what remains in the basket. And that's everything that they're going to receive for food today. Seems like a lot, because I haven't even added the coffee yet. So once I get that in there, some of this looks pretty dry from the very bottom. Now I'm wondering how this is going to fare, especially since we had all this leftover food from last time. Maybe I could spread this around a little bit and maybe create a little bit of a trench over here on the outer edge to position some of this old food that we scooped out earlier. Keep spreading things around here. And some of these other food bits that we scooped out, I'll do the same thing on this side too. I'll just dig down into the material here and throw the remainder of the food that we scooped out before in there. This also gives me that opportunity to check on the outer edges where the moisture seems to be less. Usually out here on these outer edges is where I find it to be a bit drier than I like. But over there too, I'm finding it to be very nice and moist. And that could be because I do put a heavy emphasis on spraying around the outer edges where I believe that the majority of the evaporation might be happening through this fabric material. But I feel like I've actually gotten my moisture situation under control at this point, because I think that these bins are probably as comfortable as the worms would ever want them to be. Any more moist would almost make it muddy, and I don't want it to be that way. So yeah, that's where we stand now. This bin, I guess, does not have a feeding zone indicator, so we'll just stick with that for now. We'll just start placing these covers back on. When I wet things down, I come in with the spray bottle. I usually dampen this piece of paper as well, try to moisten it, and then cover all that up. But it's actually kind of dry, so we'll see. We'll see if it picks up some of the moisture from below as the worms start to break down the material. So that's where we stand with my VermiBags. They're doing pretty good, I gotta say, and I believe any reason for concern is history. I'm not really worried at this point at all. So yeah, that's it for today. And I'm going to put this all away and get myself cleaned up, but I won't keep you around for that. That's boring. I'll part now by saying thanks for watching and thanks for keeping me company. I really appreciate it. As always, if you enjoyed the video, please remember to give it a thumbs up. That's really appreciated also. And also consider becoming a subscriber to the channel. And remember, if you ring that bell, you might actually receive a notification letting you know that there's new material online for you to come back and check out. So, all right, everyone, thanks again for watching. Have a great day. Bye-bye.